Hello and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rassool and today we are speaking about youth. It is Youth Month, and in honor of this, we are having a conversation about youth, about their challenges, but also about opportunities for empowerment. Now, after the break, we're going to be speaking to Nkosikhona Swartbooi, who is the co-founder and coordinator of the Role Models Football Club. But before that, we're going to have a look at a short video to see the work that his organization is doing in their community. Let's have a look.
And this week we started a very important relationship with the Role Models Football Club. We worked with a core group of young men and women from Role Models, starting to explore relationships, starting to talk about what it means to be a role model, what it means to be part of a club, and starting to interrogate our own behaviors and how our behaviors impact on the bigger club, and also how our behaviors impact on the younger junior players in the club. Today we've met with the senior role models, the seniors, and had conversations around what does it mean to be fathers, men, how our past impacts on our present, and lots of other topics that we'll explore further as we go along in this process. We also met with the younger people, the juniors in the club, had lots of fun with them. We played some games with them and also had some conversations about what it means to be a role model and why they're part of the Role Models Football Club. So as Inside Out, we're very excited about this new journey and this new relationship that we've been building. And we're hoping that it's going to bear lots of fruit for this community that we're working in.
That was a short video about the work being done by the Role Models Football Club. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching the Womxn Show, and it is Youth Month, and we are speaking about youth challenges and youth empowerment. And joining me in studio is Nkosikhona Swartbooi, who is the founder and coordinator at the Role Models Football Club. Welcome, Nkosikhona. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for hi to the listeners.
I'm so happy to have you on the show. As I said to you before, you guys are doing such amazing work. I read in an article that the idea for the football club was sparked by a social media post on rape culture. And so I wanted us to go into tell us what is Role Models Football Club and how was it founded?
I think how it was founded is really like a moment that we are fond of and really became a profound moment for us. A best friend of mine, Nakolelo and myself, were having conversations around this was during the time in 2019 when we've just heard about the murder of Uyinene and everyone in the country talking about the rape culture we have in South Africa and how, as men, we sort of perpetuating gender-based violence. And we thought, what is our contribution as activists? We've been activists for the past 10, 12 years, yet the systems have not worked into the favor of women and children in terms of protecting them against these issues. We are the ones as men who are perpetuating gender-based violence. It doesn't make sense that women must be leading that fight when we are the ones that are actually creating this mess. And we thought, between the two of us, we must start to take responsibility as young men in Cape Town to address this issue. And how we started was to say, actually, let's look into how the societal influences that build up a man. What is understood to be a man in our society. As Xhosa young men, in order for you to be referred to as a man, you must go to the mountain, the initiation process and all of that. And that's why we started introspecting to say, let's introspect first before we can have the conversation with everyone else. In the conversation we had, we realized that also in the Xhosa sacred sort of culture of going for initiation, there are some flaws in terms of what leads to gender-based violence in our society. The teachings that a young man gets from there, it's less about what it means to be a man in our society and what your responsibility is, but the focus is on your genitals. Now that your private parts have been initiated, you are now a man. But less so around the psychological impact of being a man and the responsibility that you then have in our society. He was brave enough to make a post about that, and I wasn't, to say, as Xhosa men, we must also introspect or reflect on the stuff that we get taught in the mountain in relation to the gender-based violence issue.
It must have been controversial.
Very controversial. Even, some of our friends were like, what are you saying? Are you saying that we as Xhosa men in particular are responsible for the gender-based violence? Not excusing them from, what is happening there, but to say, why highlight only Xhosa men? And his response was to say, because I'm a Xhosa man, I'm a Xhosa young man, I went through all of those processes. And Venda men must also reflect. This is an invitation to talk about gender-based violence in relation to how we see our role as men in our society. And that conversation actually continued offline with some of the young men from our community in Khayelitsha and Greenpoint, an area close to Site B. And we had young men who were really contesting this issue of young Xhosa men being responsible for, gender-based violence. How could you? And all it was an invitation to talk about the role that we have as men in our society in relation to misogyny, the patriarchy we see in our society, within our families, within our homes, and also the gender-based violence we're seeing also in our homes, we're seeing in our communities and in our society at large.
This is a brave thing because it sounds like, the backlash that you guys have gotten as males were also there was the hashtag not all men.
Yeah.
Right? And so that trended and across everyone's like not all men, and this sounds like a scenario where it's not all men being told even to other men who are saying, actually, we are part of this problem.
I think by the virtue of us, by the virtue of you being born as a male, there's a responsibility there that you must sort of take, because even when you're born, a boy child in some cultures are celebrated more than a girl child. A boy child is sort of given like a higher ground in terms of responsibilities within the house. It is okay for a young man to come home late at home, but it is horrible for a young woman or young girl to arrive at home past the time that has been agreed on in your household. And that's where it starts. The responsibility that's given to young girls and women in particular in our families, and just letting off the young men to be able to allowing boys to be boys.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. If you look at the teenage pregnancy, stigma is always shifted towards the girl child or the young women. But it's not, it's praising a young man to say, now we can see that you can, give birth and this is good, And that's where I think our thinking should start. You know, patriarchy and misogyny, all of these issues do not start from when we are old and when we are men, but it starts from when we are young boys. And we must start there to introspect and have those conversations within our family. As role models, we are having these conversations in terms of what it means to be a man in our society in relation to gender-based violence. We witness these things, but what is our role? Do you look away and ignore and overlook the issue, or do you take some responsibility in terms of making sure that you stand up for your community, you report a case that you see? South Africa is recorded as being one of the most violent countries for women in particular. I think we're number one in the whole world. And those are just reported cases. I can't help but imagine how much more if all cases were to be recorded, because there are gender-based violence issues or cases that are not reported that we know of in our communities
and even
in our
with the
families.
reported cases, I'm always saying, you know, our actually, you know, the initial stats, and this is not the most recent, but when we started the Womxn Show 4 years ago, we looked at over 50,000 reports of rape to police, and again, that's the ones that are reported, and about less than 5,000 of those end in a conviction. So even when we have reported cases, we are failing for justice, and then, you know, that's part of the reason a lot of women don't report, or a lot of victims and survivors of gender-based violence don't report. I want to ask you something. So I loved what you said. It's called Role Models Football Club, and our perception of role models is somebody who can teach, let's say, or be an example, etc.
Who has made it.
Who is, and preferably who has made it. And someone that we want to be. But I loved your play on words and your play on the title. So it's not just about role models and finding someone that we want to be like or that we can learn from, but it's also really just interrogating our role, whether you've made it or not, our role in society, ourselves as role models, regardless of what you do, where you work. Everybody is a role model. Right?
That's correct. Just maybe coming back to this point, I'm going to come to role models just now.
Okay.
If you had to look at one of the systemic issues with around cases reported not being, not seeing justice, if I can put it in those words, is also just a complex one. It's not to make excuse for the police, but if you currently look at how the police resources, and this is what the Social Justice Coalition has been saying for years, to say you cannot have a police ministry that is allocating police resources in a reminiscent way of how apartheid system used to. The allocation system hasn't changed. We are using the apartheid allocation system for police resources. By resources, I mean skilled and experienced investigators. When we see those, they get promotion. Where do they go? They go to Camp Space, Sea Point, and all of these affluent suburbs where crime is not. And if you are to look at the number of cases that the FCS unit, which is responsible for gender-based violence, violence against women and children, all of those vulnerable groups, there's one for the whole of like Belleville, Khayelitsha, and it's impossible to follow up and being able to give care, the necessary care that's needed to all of those cases. And why we're saying role models in our team, because that's actually it. We're wanting people to be conscious of what role are they modeling in our society. Be it whether you're a student, whether you're a learner, whether you're a young man, a learner at school. What are you modeling in our society? When you say role models and ask a young man, we've asked our members of our team to say, who's your role model? You'd be so shocked because people look at what people have, the material things that people have. You have a good car, you have a beautiful car, you have, you're drinking expensive alcohol, you're smelling good, you're sort of known as seen as that person who's held in high regard in the society. But the actions of those people are less looked into. But we're looking at the materials that those people have, and that's what you're aiming to change. To say we want to have a conversation in particular with young men, so that we can curb some of those and rescue those young men from falling into the same traps that we've fallen into. We're wanting to confront some of the issues that we were not able to sort of confront. We don't have mentors in our society, because when I make it and become a lawyer and become a judge and become a doctor, a police officer, the first thing in mind is to get that car. The second thing in mind is to move out of that community. And that leaves a vacuum in terms of who do young men and young women look up to And that's a vacuum, that because you want to be a lawyer, but you don't know how lawyers walk. You don't know how lawyers, what conversations lawyers have. They go to affluent areas or middle class areas. Josh, as a young child, as a young boy in Camps Bay, do know that their neighbor is a lawyer and they can see them every day.
Yeah.
Seeing your dreams or what you're wanting to be every day sort of conscientizes you to realize that it's possible. But what do young men in townships see every day? What do young women and young girls see every day? They see crime, they see gangsters, they see prostitution, they see substance abuse, and that's what they become. We all work so hard to buy that bottle of Hennessy at the end of the day, even though you earn 3,000 rands, and that Hennessy is 1,500 rands, half of your salary. But as soon as you get paid as a young boy from our community, and I know there's so many listeners who can relate to this, we want to all be seen with that bottle of Hennessy and that bottle of, you know, and wearing those sneakers, because that's what we grow up seeing. But where do, you know, conscious people live? Where are the activists?
And even to have, and I know we're going to speak about mental health, but also just to have the conversation that I keep reading now about very, I mean, I'll say rich, influential people who are severely depressed.
Correct.
We have been looking at the spate of suicides that have been happening with really like successful people. And so when you're talking about, and that's what that's bringing up for me, so when you're talking about looking at the things that people have, but not looking at the actions, you know, how they feel, what they've been doing, whether they fulfilled, like any of those things. Those things, you know, I read a quote the other day, your self-worth is not your net worth. And it was very, very profound. And it was profound in the way that, and this specific person, this author, was speaking about the high rates of mental health and problems and issues and drug addictions and a whole spate of other things that we are saying, even with people who have grown their net worth really huge. So, you know, thank you so much for bringing that up. I want to come back to. Was it the gender-based violence I asked about?
Yes, you asked me about gender-based violence. I think that's at the core of what we do. So what we are a platform. Role Models is more than just a football club. We're a platform for young people to engage on these issues that we're seeing in our society, particularly around gender-based violence, substance abuse, and also mental health that young people are struggling with currently. And so what we do in those spaces is to have those conversations so that we can see what issues are surfacing and where to start, because it doesn't make sense for us to be able to formulate programs for and not with. Not understanding what issues really are surfacing or young people are currently grappling with. And so what we do is we use soccer and netball as a vehicle to attract young people. And every Friday, as Role Models, we have conversations around these issues. We invite experts, we invite social workers and psychologists. And if there's anyone out there who's a social worker or a psychologist who would like to support us, we are more than, that's the invitation, and we would love that. And that's what we do. We are wanting to have conversations, particularly with young men, but also guided by young girls and women in terms of what their issues are that they're grappling with, so that we don't add more issues in terms of, instead of coming up with solutions. So we are confronting the fact that young men and boys are into substance abuse, but also participate and are leading the issues around gender-based violence. And we're wanting to conscientize people around that violence against women and children as young men. Because there are very few spaces for us to talk about those issues. But what has surfaced in those issues is that some of these cases are actually influenced by substance abuse. You know, one would go out there, get drunk, come back and violate people, beat up children and their sisters and their spouses, if depending on who they live with at home. But also there are underlying mental health issues here. And we've seen a lot of young men who are struggling with drug addiction, but we refer to them as amapara. We don't interrogate as to what are these people, why are they into drugs? Because some are into drugs because they are struggling with the fact that they don't know what fatherhood means. They've the state of fatherlessness to young men and young girls is really an issue that we didn't think was that important, but there's lots of them who have referred to this issue. Most of the people that have joined, or young boys and young girls that have joined our team, is because they can relate to the issue of fatherlessness, the state of fatherlessness in our communities. And by fatherlessness, we mean that the lack of reference in terms of what fatherhood means. We are clear in terms of what a role of a mother is. Mothers do naturally, we felt it. We know exactly how our mothers have been there for us. Biological mothers or mothers that have adopted us and raised us, right? But there's less that you can refer to in terms of a reference for being a father. What does fatherhood look like and what it means? Young men and also
sometimes fatherless is the father is around but doesn't acknowledge you. Yeah. And I just want to say, I've been reading the autobiography of Richard Williams, who's Venus and Serena Williams' father, so the tennis player's father. Yeah. And he tells the story in the beginning about, so that was in the Deep South during, Ku Klux Klan and apartheid state over there. Mm-hmm. He was being beat up one day as a boy. So his father was never involved. His father just impregnated, and then they never saw him during the day. But one day he was being beat up and he saw his father in the audience, and his father ran away. Ooh. And he obviously managed to escape. But what was interesting through the rest of the book is his anger. So as a man, he was very, even writing this as a male writing, and his anger, being unwanted, being just like not having that role model and wondering what's wrong with him from a very young age. And I thought, we don't have those conversations either. There's nowhere to go. I know for me, and my father wasn't very involved with my life, but I had a moment one day where it was just, okay, fine, you don't want a relationship with me, I won't have a relationship with you. And that was it. And it was only later when I got to therapy that I actually burst into tears. I said to the therapist, I was like, I don't know why I'm crying, because I thought I dealt with this such a long time ago.
Yeah. Definitely. And that also has an impact in terms of your psychological state. Yeah. My dad was not present when I grew up. And this is why this work is really close to my heart, because we're wanting to cover the gap that these young men and young girls have in their hearts. So one of the things, with young men, they're struggling with.
And I want you to go. We have to take a break.
Sure.
So I'm going to park this for segment 2, but we are going to take a short break, and we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are having the most engaging discussion on youth challenges, youth empowerment. And still with me in studio is Nkosikhona Swartbooi, who is the founder and coordinator of Role Models Football Club. And Nkosikhona, before the break, we had a conversation about one of the major issues affecting young people is fatherlessness, or fathers not being involved. And you were going to go on to say something about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, what those mean is that with the young girls, the young boys, and their parents, there are traumas there that people have experienced, and in townships such as ours in Khayelitsha, I would say the same about Manenberg, Bishop's Lavius, and other townships in Cape Town. There's very less psychosocial support that people get, either from government, from NGOs and so on. Those resources are very limited, and what we've seen is that with those traumas that people sort of have experienced, those play out in our society. We're seeing a lot of violence in our society, and we're not asking why. People have gone through the most, and there hasn't been a space to debrief and talk about those issues. People have bottled up, the traumas that they've endured when they were young, and there's no space to talk about.
And in fact, there's a culture of silence in most families, right? So we still see, got to keep it in the family. Correct. We can't talk about the fact that dad's gone, or this happened, or that happened.
It's also perpetuated by the police. When you go and report gender-based violence, and they'll be like, do you not want to speak with your family first and see if you can resolve this as a family? It still happens, and how do people then unpack these traumas, and who's there to support in terms of giving people coping mechanisms with those when they are being triggered, you know. I also struggle with my mental issues, and I recently started therapy. The first time I've been to a trauma debrief session was with a group called Inside Out, and I think they've been on this
They have
platform.
been on the show a few times.
They're really amazing, and I was hesitant because also the sort of psychological sessions we get into are mostly divorced from the reality, the approach that's being used, you know, and that further pushes people away from wanting to access and use that space to be able to unpack their traumas. But the approach that Inside Out was using was really engaging, such that we were just playing games and we realized later to say, I can see who they're talking about there. You know, they have a process of intergenerational traumas in terms of how, you know, traumas are sort of passed through generations. And that's one. And
they meet you where you are.
They meet you where you are. You know, they don't come with like, you know, sessions that have activities that are foreign to you. They use what you're used to, and the examples they use also are really helping. You know, so mental health is also one of the major issues that not only role models, you know, members, being young girls and young boys, but it's also their parents. Parents often do not have enough support to be able to play their roles as parents, and particularly women who are always given the you know, the role of having to raise kids. Sometimes with no support from the family, sometimes with very limited support from the family. We talk about those things because teenage pregnancy is really going high. And these boys need to understand that as soon as you bring a life into this world, you must play a responsibility. There's a role to play. You must model a role, hence the name role model. So in each and every action you sort of take on out there, you must think about what role are you modeling in our society, and what's that doing into the social fabric that we sort of have in our communities. And so that's basically what we do. We engage young men and boys. We engage young girls and women. We also, you know, have started opening up a space to engage their parents as well, because we may be doing well in terms of keeping them out of crime, out of prostitution, out of, substance abuse and all of that. But what happens at home is also important. Because we don't only want people who are nice people out there and doing great things out there, but become a big problem at home, which is one of the things we've seen with role models. People that we look up to, gender-based violence manifests in that way, that this person who is now on this interview, the Womxn Show, is actually the biggest problem at home. And we need to look into that as well. Because for us, the personal is very political. How you are as a person, you know, sort of determines your politics. You cannot be a good person in terms of understanding politics and all of that, but at home, in a closed space, you're a problem.
And we've seen a lot of that. I want to ask you about, you know, you said something earlier, you said there's too little psychosocial support in our communities. And with all of this trauma that is not addressed, this plays out in violent ways in our society that we see all the time. And again, I want to bring out something that was pulled out of that article that was published about the Role Models Football Club was, you know, and I wrote it down, so I wanted to, a lot of players had anger issues. So as they were on the field, as you were doing the sport, and connecting these two was like, oh, sport is such a great vehicle for surfacing behavior, and then I'm assuming also behavior change. You would see the way they would react and shout at each other. So how has sport helped you to then, I guess, address the anger, address the behavior change? Because, you know, when we're sitting around the table, we're all calm and we're talking and all of this stuff, but like you're saying, those trigger points, right?
Yeah. That was one of the biggest issues we had. You know, we actually provided a space to talk about gender-based violence. And people started understanding that. We actually had a camp at the Betha retreat in Franschhoek. And the things we're talking about there is what sex is, what consent is, and all of those things. And you'd be shocked that people didn't understand the difference between sex and what consent is, and that, you know, consent can be withdrawn. And in withdrawing consent, you then, whatever you do after that, is, constitutes rape. It is rape, right?
Sorry to break you, but I also want to come in and ask, since you're having these conversations, has a lot of it surfaced about even definitions of gender-based violence and what? So from verbal to emotional to those things. There's a lot of murky, we would call it murky areas, but people don't have context for that. They think rape is rape and beating someone is beating something. But anything under that is sort of not.
I mean, that's been one of the issues. Language has been like very alienating, the kind of language you use around these issues. You talk about misogyny and go to my township and ask any old lady if they know what misogyny is. Ask them if they know what patriarchy is.
I didn't even know what it is up until a few years ago.
You know, what consent is, what is sex, and all of those things. So the language you sort of use is not the same language that people understand on the ground. And that's one of the things that we're doing as role models, to unpack what those issues are, what the language entails, so that they're able to also engage on that. The anger issue that I wanted to speak to is actually one of the issues that we encountered when we started role models, such that our boys were happy before they play. They would sing Amagwijo. Now Amagwijo is like a war cry, you know, in English, but that's loosely translated. You know, the songs we sing before we get to the field, you know, and many of those songs have messages. With those messages are actually a reflection of the pain that young men have. There's one song that they used to sing, Askisi, I'm sorry, mama. It's like an apology. Hey, mama, wami, I'm sorry. It's an apology to disappointing one's mother, to say, you raised me so well, you sacrificed a lot, but look at how I am. I'm into drugs, I'm into alcohol, substance abuse, gender-based violence, and I'm sorry for these things. It goes with also emotions, right? And so that's one way of unpacking those. And when they get into the field, that's where the problem started. There was no singing. There was no sort of like collective that's holding us, you know? One was playing there within a team, and sometimes will be harshly tackled. The fouls that are committed there, such that one would be injured, and they'd want to fight back, because the response they know to violence or hurt or pain is violence, and there's no other, you know, alternative they've been taught to say this is how you resolve conflict. You know, this is how you approach a person who's violent to you. The only thing they've seen and are familiar with is violence. You are messing up with me, I'll mess with you, you know. And that became like a huge issue for us, such that we purposely had rules in our team. You show any violent act in the field or in the society, you are sacked from the team. You cannot be part of the role models team until you come back, apologize to the team, and you bring the person that you've offended, and we have a conversation in terms of addressing your behavior. We cannot be harboring violent people when we are saying we are wanting to stop violence in our society. So we had those rules, and I've had good players that we suspended in some important matches last year that could have led us to winning the league, because we finished number 2 last year in the Greater Blue Downs Local Football Association. And it's those matches where we suspended our good players because the behavior was not matching the vision of the team. And we suspended them and said, you will come to the field if you still want to play during your suspension and watch the team lose. You're a good player, but you can't play. And seeing them in tears and crying meant that they really have found home within role models. One of the things that young people, in particular, young girls and boys are struggling with is the identity politics. You know, identity, I mean, in terms of finding what you are. You are not educated, you are not a lawyer, you are not a learner, you are not a student because you dropped out of school or you are done with your matric. What are you?
What are you? If
they are to get into a gang, then they have an identity. I am a Vura, I'm a Vato, I am, what is this thing that's called, I'm a Gupta now in Kailicha, you know? That's identity there. If you do anything wrong to me, I have a family, a place of belonging, and that's what you're trying to build. Because also there's this growing culture of prostitution also towards young girls. It's a rape covered as prostitution, where old men who are in their 30s are sleeping with 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, and 15-year-olds, and they're giving them money in return. And that, for me, is not prostitution. It is rape, full stop.
Yeah.
Because those kids cannot give consent to sex. And so those are some of the things.
Legally also.
Legally also, yeah. So those are the things that we sort of are grappling with and are sort of inviting the parents to say, we are doing the little that we can. Come join and help us do more. And those are the things that I think, in terms of violence, it's not only the young men playing soccer, but it's also the young girls when they're playing their netball. You can see sometimes that they show anger when they're being tackled in a particular way. And the space that we've created is built such that we debrief on those and using the mechanisms that we've been given by Inside Out to say we open up a circle and have a men's circle, we have a women's circle and talk about these issues. If there's an incident that happened in the field, we come back to it every Friday and talk about those and find ways to which we can advise one another in terms of being positive male role models and positive female role models in our society.
That's amazing. I mean, that's the way we need to be addressing things. And I just want to come back to something you said. You said, when they're violent on the field or in the sport, you have to suspend them, even if it's really good players, even if it's before an important match, because we cannot be harboring violent people if we advocate against violence. And what it showed me was also the importance of consequences, right? So when we look at gender-based violence, we spoke about the low conviction rate earlier. We know that just from a domestic violence perspective, often it's a private matter, nobody gets involved. There's often no consequences for perpetrators. And so I love that you are instituting sort of this consequence, and less consequences, the more high profile you become, right? As we've seen.
Yeah,
and so this is something that you've built into the program.
Definitely. I mean, we know that they love playing soccer, and we've purposely chose to play soccer not in Khayelitsha, but in a different community where they will interact with people that they don't usually interact with. And so we chose the Greater Blue Dance LFA, Local Football Association, because they hardly interact or play soccer outside of Khayelitsha. And that's privilege to some extent, being transported to play in this particular area. You can, and they love that. It's what has attracted them. In these Friday sessions where we talk about these things, there's one example before I get to this now. When we came back from the camp, from the Bethel Retreat camp, we're talking about rape and all of these things. And there's this young boy who saw a young girl passing by, and they wanted to talk to them. And they started whistling to them. And this guy was like, misogyny. And I was like, wow, 18-year-old. Now he has the language for it. He can point it out. But before, we knew that it was wrong, but there was no language that we can use against it. So this speaks to the importance of that language. So this doesn't only, so when we hear of those instances that they've done this wrong thing at home, they've done wrong in the society, it's not only just limiting to saying, if you fight in the field, then we suspend you. Also, when your parents are not happy with you, we call you and say, your parents aren't happy with you, we cannot be seen to be condoning that. We need you to change your ways, and in order for you to continue being part of this team, we need to get reports from your parents saying that you're behaving well and you've changed. And we've seen some changes there. There are some who are into gangsterism with murders under their names, but now they've become the most polite people ever. And they love the team. They want to be there for the team. Some of them were selling drugs, but they're now great players and great leaders within the team. And that's a model that we sort of are proud of, that we've created, that at least we've done something around this issue. And just to clarify, I am not the founder. I'm a co-founder of Role Models. Yes. It was started by myself and my best friend that I grew up with, Nkosikhona, who's also an activist. We sort of have been doing the land and housing work together for the past 12, 13 years.
So this is amazing. And I wanted to say just, also on the issue of sort of suspending good players, let's call it that, so having consequences just from an institutional perspective, right? Because what we usually see, and we see especially where there are very prominent people within an institution, whether the institution is a university, whether it's, Harvey Weinstein, R. Kelly, all of these things that we've seen, the protection around somebody because they are really good at what they are doing here. But even just like on any level, just instituting these consequences within institutions and understanding. And I meet lots of women who have been assaulted at work and continue to have to work with this person with no consequences whatsoever, or women have had to leave, or women have gotten fired for being troublemakers. So, and bringing up these things. So I just want to applaud that, and the fact that there is follow through there.
I think it's a model that the society should maybe look into.
Yeah.
There ought to be consequences.
And even in homes, right? Actions. So if it's the breadwinner, there's no consequences for him.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a model that I think we're wanting to replicate. So the work that we're doing, we're not only just limiting to role models. We are now going to be in conversation with the Blue Downs Greater Blue Downs Local Football Association to talk about how we can also replicate our model with other teams. Because within the Greater Blue Downs Local Football Association, there are about 13 to 14 teams. One team has about 7 divisions, under 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 2 senior teams. And you can imagine that's about close to 100 young men and boys that you can target within one team. And so we are starting a model here that we're wanting to replicate within that LFA, and also within the Greater Blue Downs Netball Union that our ladies are participating in. Yeah. So all of these are just, we're formulating processes or programs that we can share also with others. We recently had a conversation with DSTV in Joburg. They're doing similar work to the work that we're doing, that they're targeting the local football associations and sort of bringing these programs into that space, because currently there's no one organizing our local football associations, and they have a lot of people. A lot of young men and boys, a lot of young women and girls are found over weekends in sport. Why are we inviting them out of where they want to be to come to a hall? Why don't we take our programs to the fields where they are and meet them where they are, and use what they love to sort of bring about education? And one of the things that DSTV is promoting is edu-football. So using football, using sports to educate people to be able to play or participate in sport, whilst also being educated about the societal issues that we're grappling with.
And I think this is so fantastic, because when we think about the sport, we think about soccer, basketball, whatever it is, we're thinking about just sort of the sport and just the tournaments and just the training. But what's innovative about this model is actually you take on whole holistic programs. All the conversations that you say you're having, and then tagging it onto soccer where they are, and then helping to generate like proper real behavior change. We have to take another short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we've been having such a great conversation about youth challenges, youth empowerment, and more. And still with us in studio is Nkosikhona Swartbooi, who is the co-founder and coordinator of Role Models Football Club. And Nkosikhona, I just wanted us to play out and get some lessons from you. So you've been doing this work for a while now. You've been working with the young people. Part of the problem is that often young people don't have voices in the spaces where they are in. You guys have spent some years now listening to the voices of the youth. We know that there are serious mental health problems, and I think let's just focus on that, because gender-based violence is itself a consequence of mental health problems. So we know that they are struggling. They've got unemployment. They've got identity politics, lack of identity. They've got like all these issues. What can we as a society, I think, as the audiences, as parents, as even some of us out there, youth ourselves, what can we do about this?
This is actually a big one. We need to look into why are the young people involved in what they're doing. Young people mostly need love, and we hardly give love to young people. Been recently with my colleagues thinking about what politics of care could look like.
I love that.
Because most of the time, we emasculate men, we emasculate young boys. They fall on the field when they get tackled. We'll be like, yeah, come up, don't be a sissy, just, rub it off. And it's emasculating. Even in the way that we do politics, it's always angry and it's emasculating. We need to unlearn that. My friend Akolile came up with a concept: unlearn, disrupt, and rebuild. So we need to unlearn ways in which we grew up with fatherhood, mental health, the fact that when you talk about mental health, there's stigma around that. We need to unlearn that. We need to rebuild our social fabric because it's torn apart. Our communities are really torn apart. Gangsters are ruling Cape Town, and that's a fact. You go to any community, there's no development that will proceed without gangsters saying yes or no. And that's a social fabric that's torn apart. Where are the activists? Let's get back to organizing our communities. The third one is, disrupting. We need to disrupt how things are being done. So unlearn, disrupt, and rebuild. We need to disrupt this old way of organizing communities and meet people where they are. We need, if they love soccer, let's buy more soccer balls, more soccer kits, and get them to play soccer and have a conversation with them. Let's not try to change what they like, to try and fit them into a box that we've agreed on with a particular funder and try to tick boxes. Let's meet where people are and make sure that whatever we do has meaning, because I am doing this way because I'm a father to a 6-year-old. And I need to be, and I'm doing this so that the legacy I leave for my child, the world I leave her in, it's a better world for her and others who will be still remaining in the world when I've passed on.
No, I agree with you. I often say, in this work that we're doing, especially with gender-based violence, I keep on, you can get really depressed, right? And disappointed, and at the end, and we're not making any difference. And I also have a daughter, she's 9. And I keep saying the only thing that gets me back up is to say, well, at the very, very least, when she's grown up, things must be 5 to 10% better. Yeah. And to understand that it's a huge complex problem and we can't change everything, but 5 to 10% better just helps me to refocus and say that's something that we can do. I love this unlearn, disrupt, rebuild. I want to just one last thing. You're talking about disrupting, traditional notions of masculinity. Des from Inside Out was on my show once, and he said something really profound. He said, men don't cry. Men don't want to cry. Men are ashamed of crying. But actually, when you think about it, physiologically, crying is the opposite of laughing. Yeah. It is a normal response.
If laughing is okay, why is crying
exactly?
Not okay?
So we should be okay to cry. It's okay to cry when something bad is happening, as we're okay to laugh if something is really, really funny. And just on that note, I think just a comment from you on on disrupting, on men and feelings. There must be something. You're having these conversations, you're having these retreats. If we're not talking about trauma, they're talking about things that make them sad and depressed and that have happened to them and that hurt them. Those are, things that they must be showing emotions they don't usually show.
Correct. And that's the kind of platform we're creating.
And how can we, I think, again, as a community, as society, how can we create, make the space safe for men who do that? Because a lot of people will say, even as women, we say, oh, we want you to be more empathetic and emotional. Yeah. But then if a man does cry or is emotional, it's unacceptable. So
that's the space that we're sort of trying to create, to make sure that people are comfortable enough to be vulnerable. It is hard to open that up, because also what we get taught as young men growing up, we're seeing people sort of like, manhood is measured by the amount of pain you can take on, and the amount of violence you can inflict, and that's really hard. To really unlearn, because that's what you grew up seeing. Yeah. But we need to do better around that. Activism, there's no way of being safe about it, but we need more allies. We need to get more allies. We need to turn all the men in our society into being ambassadors of gender-based violence, of mental health, but also role models that are advocating against gender-based violence. For the reasons that look at the criminals. Everyone wants to have their families safe. Everyone, including like a very hardcore criminal, they want their family to be safe. And if we can all have the same attitude we have towards our families, towards everyone else, then we are creating a better world for us and for also our kids as well. So let's continue being positive role models in our society, and remember that any action we do is sort of modeling a way of living in our community, and we need to be conscious of that.
I love that so much. Thank you so much for all of this. I think also just to say, you know, I always say to survivors sometimes, you know, if they're victims of survivors, they ask me for advice. I always try to say the first person that you go to might not be able to help. The first person or the second person you go to might even give you the wrong answer. And I think I just want to say there are allies, you know, by nature of you sitting here, by nature of us having this conversation. It's important also to sometimes go out and find that safe space because it does exist. And so, Nkosikhona, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us on the show, and thank you for listeners for tuning in.
Yay. And so that brings us to the end of our hour together. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and that's all we have time for. I'm Lenina Rassool. Goodbye.